Alright guys, let's talk about Latin verbs, and this will sort of, in a way, complete our set of Latin information, because you'll know about nouns, you'll know about prepositions, and now you'll know about verbs. So you'll have sort of the full sets. You've talked about adjectives as well, so we almost have covered all of our parts of speech here. Now we'll be building on that knowledge throughout the rest of the year, but now you'll have those very basic building blocks that we're going to be using for our sentences. So just like Latin nouns have 4 properties, case, number, gender, and declension, Latin verbs also have several properties. They have tense. Tense you might be used to in English as just being when the action takes place, but there's an addition in Latin. It also tells you if the action is complete or incomplete. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to perfect and imperfect tense. So it's the next tense we're going to be learning. Latin verbs also have voice. Voice tells you the relationship between the subject and the verb. I realize that sounds a little weird. It's something we do in English fairly rarely in English. It's called passive voice. Latin uses passive voice all the time. You're used to active voice. Subject does the verb, and verb happens to the direct object, right? The boy throws the ball. In passive voice, that's reversed, and the verb is being done essentially or happening to the direct object. So the ball was thrown by the boy. It's not something you really need to worry about yet. We're not going to learn passive voice. You're not going to learn passive voice until you're in high school, in fact. But it's something to be aware of, and that's what voice is telling you, the relationship between the subject and the verb. Then we have mood. Mood tells you the kind of action that's taking place. So is it a straightforward action? Is it a command? Is it something that may or may not happen? So that's the sort of the question, right? These are our moods. Person tells you who is doing the action, and the number tells you how many are doing the actions. Our choices for person in Latin are first, second, or third, just like in English, and our choices for number are singular and plural. Person in English, well, we'll talk about person a little bit more when we get more in depth, and I'll talk about that a little bit more about what the first, second, and third means. So let's continue talking about some of the things that make up our Latin verbs first, then we'll go more in depth into those details. So Latin verbs also have something called principal parts. And these are the things you've been memorizing for your vocab quizzes, the ari, awi, atuses, and then the other forms, some of which are irregular, that I told you we'll learn later on. Principal parts are the stem of the verb forms. So each principal part is used to build a different kind of verb. Your first principal part is the dictionary form of the verb. It's what you look up in the dictionary, right? And it usually ends in O or M. And it's also the first person singular present active indicative form. And don't worry if that doesn't mean anything to you yet, we'll talk about it in just a moment. And then the second principal part, which is the one that ends in RE, right, tells you which conjugation a verb belongs to. It's the present tense stem, so if we're dealing with present tense, so happening now, is going to use the second principal part. And it's also the infinitive. And we'll talk more about infinitives later on in the year, but an infinitive just means to verb, so to run, to jump, that sort of thing. All right, so let's talk about person and number. So what person is basically telling you is how close the speaker is to the action. The closest I can be to the action, first person, is if I'm doing the action. I am recording a video. The next closest I can be is talking to someone who's doing the action. You are listening to the video. And the furthest I can be is to talk about somebody else who's doing an action. Mr. Dixon is teaching language arts. We have these persons in English too, obviously, they're right here. We don't talk about them as much. Usually the context you might hear them talked about is in language arts classes in terms of a narrator, right? First person narrator, third person narrator. Once read a book called Anthem, which is written in first person plural, which was very annoying to read. So the narrator would say, we went to the store instead of I went to the store, even though it's only one person. I've also read, if you've ever read like a choose your own adventure book, that's going to be in second person singular. The second person plural, I know y'all is sort of a slang term. The reason I use it though is because we don't have a really accurate second person plural in English, and this works very well for that situation. Okay, sorry for the pausing. I was trying to record without the AC on in the background because it's so loud. Okay, so let's talk about what I meant by when I said the first person, the first principal part was the first person present active indicative. So here you can see at the top, present active indicative. Let's talk about what that means and what it is. So present is the tense when the action happens and if it's complete or incomplete. In the case of present tense, it's only a reference to the time. The complete or incomplete can work either way for present tense. It's active is the voice. So this means the subject is going to do the verb and will come in front of the verb when we translate. Its mood is indicative. Indicative mood means you're pointing things out. You're making things as if they're a statement of fact. They don't have to be, but you're saying it like it is, right? Mrs. Perry teaches Latin. Mrs. Perry will go to the store. I'm saying these as if they're going to happen or are currently happening. So that's what the PAI, present active indicative, stands for. You translate them as I verb, I am verbing, or I do verb. And to form it, you go to the second principal part, drop the RE, and add the endings. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. I'm about to tell you. But these are the endings you're going to add. O or M, S and T, moose, tis, and T. So you can hear a little rhythm there, right? O or M, S and T, moose, tis, and T. O or M, S and T, moose, tis, and T. I know that's a little annoying. Recite it over and over again. You want this drilled into your brain. Trust me, your Latin life's going to be much easier if you memorize these endings. But in the meantime, we will be putting them on our charts in class. So how do you do this? What does that mean using those endings going to the second principal part? So let's break it down. I'll show you how to conjugate. Conjugating is what we call the term that means putting a verb through its endings, essentially. So we're going to conjugate a verb into the present active indicative tense and then into all of its persons and numbers. So first we need to start with our verb and we need our principal part. So we're going to use WOCO. It's my favorite verb to use for examples. It's a nice regular first conjugation verb. And you can see WOCO's principal parts are WOCO. That's our first principal part. WOCARE, so that you drop that O and add these on as stems. WOCARE is our second principal part. WOCAWE is our third principal part, and WOCATUS is our fourth principal part. Remember the rule, go to the second principal part, so we're going to do that next. So we go to our second principal part and we get WOCARE. Next, we drop the RE, so do that. We get WOCA, and now we have our verb stem. Then we add our endings to it. The first person singular ends in O, remember the rhythm? O or M, S and T, moose, tis, and T. Well, that O is already there in the first principal part. The first principal part, like I said earlier, is the first person singular present active indicative, right? So for the rest of them, we're going to build off of the stem that we created by going to the second principal part and dropping the RE. When we get WOCO, WOCAS, WOCAT, WOCAMUS, WOCATUS, WOCANT. And our person and number comes from those endings. So O, I call, S, you call, T, he, she, it calls, moose, we call, tis, y'all call, nt, they call. Right, and when you see these in a sentence, you are going to label them. So far, you know you circle your verbs. So what else do you need to do? You need to give the person, whether it's first, second, or third, which you can determine from the ending, and the number, singular or plural, which again you'll determine from the ending. And then you'll give me the tense, voice, and mood. For the next few weeks, you're only going to know present active indicative verbs. So till like second semester, the only tense, voice, and mood you're going to have is PAI. I don't like to waste time or space spelling that out. So I'll call these PAI, not present active indicative verbs, but that's what I mean by them. So for example, if I gave you WOCAT, you'd look on your chart, you'd see that T, it's third person singular, and it's present active indicative, PAI. So that's for our nice regular verbs. And then of course we have sum. We've already dealt with sum a little bit when we had the word est. Remember I told you est was the third person singular present active indicative of sum, and that I'd explain what that meant. Now you know, yay. Sum is a highly irregular verb. and that makes it a little more challenging to deal with, but we'll talk about how we deal with it in the present tense. It's especially difficult actually in the present tense because present tense is built off of the second principal part, and sum has an irregular second principal part. So it means I am or to be. It's irregular in just about every language, including English. So, it's not just Latin that makes this challenging. It's a linking verb. It's the most common linking verb. And like I said, it's irregular pretty much everywhere. So its principal parts are sum, esse, fui, futurus. Notice how I didn't put hyphens at the front of these. These are not endings. These are the full principal part form. So the second principal part is not sum esse. It's just esse, E-S-S-E. That's it. Now remember, my rule for present tense is go to the second principal part, drop the R-E. Well, there's no R-E. That's going to make it a little challenging. However, for a good bit of them, you can actually go to the second principal part and drop the SE and you'll be okay. That doesn't always work throughout the whole conjugation of sum, so let me show you. So our first principal part, sum, is still the first person singular present active indicative. That's nice. If we go to our second principal part, drop the last two letters, SE. Hey, we ended with an S. Well, that's already our second person ending. So S will stay the same. We'll add our T to get est. Then, for some reason, we go back to our first principal part and add us, so we get sumus. Then we go back to our second principal part and add our tis and get estis. And then back to the first principal part and add nt to get sunt. So sum, I am, est, you are, est, he, she, it is, sumus, we are, estis, y'all are, sunt, they are. And notice the form does change in English too, from am, are, and is, right? So it's irregular in English too. Another one you need to memorize, right? Sum, est, sumus, estis, sunt. Sum, est, sumus, estis, sunt. Sum, est, sumus, estis, sunt. Another one you'll hear me say all the time. Basically, anytime I conjugate sum or refer to sum in class, I'm going to run through the whole present tense conjugation for you because I want to make sure you get that memorized. Last thing we're going to talk about today is subject-verb agreement. This is a thing that exists in English. We just don't think about it too much. It's something we tend to do sort of naturally. And in fact, when I've taught language arts and I've tried to teach this formally to students, it actually tends to throw them off and they end up messing up the subject-verb agreement. So but we do need to know how this works in Latin. And what it means is that the number of your subject, so singular or plural, and its person, first, second, or third, must match the number and person of your verb. So basically, if you're dealing with first person I, then your verb has to end in O, because that's first person singular. If you're talking to someone, you, your verb's going to have to end in S, because that's second person singular. If you're talking about someone, your verb's going to end in T, because that's third singular. So some of the common pronouns that we'll see in Latin that are used with verbs is ego, which means I, so that's your first singular pronoun, I, and its verb ending will be O or M, because it's O or M, S, and T, right? To means you, it's second person singular pronoun, right, you, and the verb ending will be in S. And if you're talking about someone, mother, father, caecilius, or about something, the kitchen, it's going to be third person singular, so your verb will end in T. If you're talking about someone in the plural or something in the plural, then, mother, father, slave, mothers, fathers, slaves, or streets, then your third person plural verb ending is going to be NT. All right? I didn't give you the plural for ego and to because we'll learn about those plural pronouns later on, but you still might see plural verb endings, mus and tis, as well. And I'll show you some examples of how they might show up without a pronoun in just a moment. Because in Latin sentences, you don't need a nominative case noun to have a complete sentence. The verb can tell you the subject. Now, you have to have a subject. All sentences, to be a complete sentence, must have a subject and a verb. But in Latin, you don't necessarily have to write out the subject because you can get the subject from your verb ending. So the takeaway from this, person and number of your noun, of your subject, must equal the person and number of your verb. Okay. So some examples, cocum, woco. If I look on my chart, is the accusative singular ending. Accusative case nouns cannot be subjects. So this has to be my direct object. So I get my subject then from my O ending, which is first person singular, which is I. So it means I call the cook. Kibos amos, same thing. Kibos is in the accusative plural, so it can't be my subject. Amos ends in S, so its person is second singular, you. You like the foods. I know that sounds a little strange, but that's correct Latin, if not exactly correct English. A tricky thing to watch out for on second singular PAI verbs is that AS ending looks an awful lot like the AS ending that you get on accusative plural nouns in the first declension. So make sure you know your vocabulary, know which words are nouns and which words are verbs, and are familiar with, the verbs will typically be at the end of the sentence. Kenam coquit, again, we got accusative singular, can't be my subject. So I get my subject from the T, he or she. Since Grumio is our cook and he's the male character in the story, he cooks dinner. And then you can use our prep phrases too in theatro. Theatro is ablative case, right? This is our prep phrase in the theater. So we look at our ending, it's NT, that's third plural. So they sit in the theater. And then I made this nice little chart. Those of you who had me for Latin in 6th grade may or may not remember this, or may not have seen it, depending on what our particular grading period did. But I find this a nice illustration of the person in numbers. So Latinam amo, first person singular O, I love Latin, me talking about me. Latinam amamus, we love Latin, so us in a group talking about ourselves. Latinam amas, you love Latin, so me talking to someone. Latinam amatis, y'all love Latin, so me talking to multiple people. Latinam amat, he loves Latin, so talking about someone. And Latinam amant, they love Latin, so talking about more than one person. So that is what I have on Latin verbs for you all this video. Please make sure that you've taken your notes, that you've taken your note-taking quiz, and that you write down any questions you have for me so we can go over them in class and have a lovely, lovely rest of the day.